Hi, everyone, and welcome to another In Conversation. Now, my guest tonight could perhaps be described as a curator of the greatest museum on the planet. As one of the world's leading maritime archaeologists, he has over 40 years of scientific expertise under his lead-weighted belt. But before he tells us why he has spent so much of his life deep under the ocean waves, I'll introduce him to you with this little video clip.
So much of history has really been tightly kept in a little box that archaeology is now cracking open. I started in archaeology when I was 14, and I figured, what could I do? What was left to be found? 95% of the oceans remain unknown. So if you want to go explore, if you want to find something, the oceans are a tremendous place to work. My name is Jim Delgado, and I'm a maritime or an underwater archaeologist. Maritime archaeology is the study from what people leave behind of how we as human beings have interacted with the oceans and with lakes and rivers. It goes back thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, as people harvested goods from the sea, learned how to fish, built the first canoes to cross the oceans, till today's modern times when big, massive ships ply the oceans carrying oil, large numbers of people, and in the 21st century still transport 90% of the things that people buy and use by water.
James, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to chat with someone who is as passionate about what they do in life as you are. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alastair. It's good to be here.
So, Jim, in that little video clip we just watched, you mentioned your interest in archaeology began as a young boy, just 14 years old. So what was it that happened then that so sparked your imagination?
I would say it was the magic of school teachers being exposed to, in the 6th grade, this amazing course that spoke about all of human history and being fascinated with ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Mayan ruins, Greek temples, native sites in my own neighborhood. All of that was compelling. But what also helped was the fact that I had parents who supported that. My father would drive me regularly to the local museum where there were Egyptian antiquities, and what powerfully struck me was an opportunity to go into a replica tomb from the Valley of the Kings with the tour guide in his best ever, I should say, improvisational role, as if he'd come out of the set of an old-time movie, saying, "Welcome to the tomb." I was captivated. What more could I do but think about pursuing the past? And then, in my own neighborhood, they began construction and struck the remains of an ancient site thousands of years old, full of burials that nobody cared about, except this 14-year-old. And so it began.
Because I read somewhere that your very understanding mother was sort of tolerant of some of the stuff you used to get up to in the bathroom. Do you want to share that? Do you want to share that with?
Well, that sounds so terribly dirty, and it was because these people had been exhumed by bulldozers, their bones crushed. It was horribly upsetting, and I felt that the need was there to put them back together. So I would take what I had saved and wash it carefully, reassemble it, ultimately packaged it, and we were able to return that to the descendants of that tribe for a reburial long before it ever became the law or was seen as the right thing to do. But in that, what also got fired up was this sense that the past should not be destroyed, it shouldn't be plundered, it needed to be studied, and wherever possible, it needed to be saved. And so it began.
But from that seed of early beginnings with an interest in archaeology, so how then did the very specific area of maritime archaeology, when did you make that decision to sort of branch off into the maritime area?
Well, I grew up in a family that had no problem with boats. Now, we didn't go in big ocean sailing cruises. At that stage, we basically fished off of my grandfather's boat or water skied off of the other grandfather's boat. But I grew up around the water. And I also grew up at the southern end of San Francisco Bay. When I was early in my career, I was able to join the U.S. National Park Service. And with that, right at the start, they struck a ship buried in downtown San Francisco. And seeing that emerge from the midst of a pit in the heart of the downtown financial district, with high rises rising above it and around it, was captivating, particularly to note that this had been there at a time when the ocean had come blocks ashore to what then was, a beach, and now was the main street through the financial district. But with everything perfectly preserved from being sealed in mud, it was as if it was, as I would later say, a gold rush Pompeii.
Well, we're going to come to talk about the those gold rush ships, because that's a really fascinating area of conversation. But just still generalizing, Jim, what I mean, apart from the obvious fact that one is underwater, what is the difference between maritime archaeology and land archaeology? What are the kind of different set of problems you got?
Well, it's funny. I mean, for years, we always used to debate, what did we call what we do? Is it maritime archaeology? Is it marine archaeology? Is it nautical archaeology? Is it underwater archaeology? And ultimately, where I come down to it is I'm a maritime archaeologist, because what I study and look at is the role of maritime culture and activity in the larger picture of human activity. Nautical archaeologists may study the particulars of ships. Marine archaeologists can study aspects of maritime culture, but they're looking at wider areas. And underwater archaeology is any archaeology that's done while you're wet. So for me, maritime archaeology hits at something very key, and that is, with so much of the planet covered by water, my colleagues and I truly believe that the most dominant thread in human history is that connection to the sea, to the rivers, and to the lakes. And with that, you can begin to understand more about who we are as a species, as we built craft and built ports to service those craft, and had waterfront communities that were reliant on the trade that happened to those craft, as well as ships built for exploration, for colonization, for exploitation, for war. All of this is reflected in all of these shipwrecks and these maritime sites, like the one I was first introduced to, underneath the streets and sidewalks of San Francisco, only wet when the tide came in under the street and through the mud, but just the same, still wet.
And Jim, what does it feel like to swim through a shipwreck? I mean, is it a very dangerous thing to do? Sounds dangerous to me.
Well, my mother was alive. I never really shared all of those stories with her. I was fortunate enough that the government sent me to a U.S. Army dive school at the Presidio of San Francisco. So with that, learning from Master Sergeant Dutch Bowen, I had a very good grounding in how not to try to kill myself. But yes, it can be risky, but I think oftentimes people overplay that. In my career, I've had a few close calls, but for the most part, the diving is the environmental situation which you find yourself when you work. But what you also find, because you get down there, and that has been the case for so many years, unless somebody's trawled through it or dug on it previously or dived, you're seeing things that in some ways are time capsules. And with that, particularly with more intact ships, there's this sense of journeying into the past. And say with Titanic, for example, because it takes so long to get there, falling through the water, that you undergo an almost mythical voyage in your own mind, falling into the darkness, until suddenly there ahead of you with the lights on is the bow of Titanic. And there's nothing really quite like that. It is that moment of Carter looking through the crack in the door of Tut's tomb. And what do you see? Wonderful things, amazing things.
Well, we're certainly going to come to the Titanic in a little bit, but it's a pretty small and exclusive club you're a member of. I mean, do you guys all know each other? Is it very competitive?
it is not competitive so much as it is a collegial group of colleagues. Now, yes, I mean, I'm sure there's moments where anybody says, wow, I wish I'd found that. But what I see, particularly as I've been in the field for so long, is so many of us do know each other. Many of us went to school together. Many of us have worked together on projects, that the women, the field is very, very female as well as male. The women and the men who work in it, collaborate, share notes, talk to one another. We have an annual conference. And perhaps the best way to phrase it is, because we're all maritime people, we understand how lighthouses work. Lighthouses don't compete with one another. They work together in tandem to set a course that someone can follow. And for us, what we do collectively offers a pathway that has been lit by research that opens doors to amazing aspects of the past and connections to human experience.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, I like that analogy. And you also you preempted my next question, which was I was going to ask if are there many women in that rather exclusive club, and you told me there are, and that's great. I don't know, had in my mind that it was a rather male kind of dominated profession, but you've now told me that's not the case, which is great.
Oftentimes, I mean, we just lost George Bass, who has often been referred to as the father of underwater archaeology, when he passed away just a week ago at age 88.
Oh.
But at the same time, George was out there working off the coast of Turkey in 1960 with the late Peter Throckmorton. Two women were there as well. One, Joan de Platt Taylor of the UK, who is really one of the great founding mothers of underwater maritime nautical archaeology and the founding editor of the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology, and the late Honor Frost, who also, as another archaeologist from the UK, did much to champion and pioneer the field. And those women, as well as many other, were right there at the start and have persisted over time. So it's never really been a male field as much as it's been a field in which the siren song of the sea calls to many. And increasingly what I see is not only is the field gender diverse, it also has become far more diverse in other ways as maritime underwater nautical archaeology has spread around the globe and moved off of the old colonial model of, well, here come the Americans, or here come the British, or here come the Germans to dig in somebody else's country, to amazing programs in South America, in Asia, in Africa, throughout Europe, and with indigenous peoples also participating. And as I've seen in the project I'm currently working on, people who come from different ethnic groups, some of whom have been underrepresented in past archaeological study or whose voices have not been heard. That includes Inuit in the North, it includes African Americans in the United States, but it also includes people from so many other perspectives. And that's what I think archaeology does best, is we look to what the physical evidence says, but what it says can be interpreted in so many ways and have so many different meanings for other people. Mm-hmm. And there lies the beauty of scholarly discussion as well as getting the public engaged.
Absolutely. Jim, I should just probably point out to viewers at this point that this conversation we're having right now would normally be live, but actually this one is pre-recorded, and that's entirely my fault. The reason is, for people who are watching this, is that I'll be on a sailboat bobbing around somewhere off the French coast. At least that's the plan right now. And the reason I mention that is that if anybody's going to send in a question, Jim won't be able to answer it because I won't be able to ask him because I won't see it. Jim, we can forward those questions on to you, and maybe if you have the time, you could maybe pen a little reply. Would be wonderful. Anyway, tell us about your first proper excavation, Jim, the Gold Rush waterfront in San Francisco, where ships were literally transformed into buildings.
When gold was discovered in California in 1848, by the time the news got out to the rest of the United States and the world, what resulted was this rush by land for some Americans, but by so many others, particularly from other countries, by sea. And it's the maritime experience, I think, that really defines the gold rush. You had Just in the United States alone, several hundred ships sailing in response to the news of the gold discovery, matched by several hundred others. So by the end of 1849, over 1,000 ships had arrived, and San Francisco had blossomed from a small community on the shores of the bay in a tiny, muddy little cove of a few thousand into a city that would soon be 20,000. Within a short period of time, San Francisco became not only the 12th largest city in North America, it also became America's great port on the Pacific. And what made that happen was not just the influx of people, but it was the trade that regularly went on, but it also was the use by the city's founding merchants and entrepreneurs in a flat, muddy cove that was basically a mud flat at low tide. They built long piers out a mile into the water and moored ships alongside them, and some of those ships were turned into buildings. That was because, of course, in Britain, ships had been used as hulks for prisoners. They had also been used in Hong Kong as floating warehouses for opium. And so these store ships, also used in Royal Navy dockyards and the rest, inspired the creation of store ships, and close to 200 vessels were turned into floating buildings, town jail, warehouses, offices, a hotel, a church, you name it. Mm-hmm. And over time, some of those ships were either purposely scuttled, others burned, but it left, particularly after a massive waterfront fire in May 1851, the entire central part of the waterfront destroyed, so much so that all they could do was dump fill over it, make it dry land, and in that fashion, San Francisco commenced marching out across the bay until the state passed a law in 1855 saying, no further than this line. And behind that line, today's San Francisco waterfront, where the ferry building is, you have sealed in the mud 20, 30 feet below the streets, this amazing, packed in mud, airtight, wet environment. And in this came the ship Niantic, the first one to be hauled ashore, a former China trader turned whaler. The crew had learned of the California gold discovery. The captain had instructions to make some money. So they stopped in Panama, picked up 249 people, converted the ship into a cruise ship in a way, though I think anybody sailing on a Viking cruise right now would not envy them. Wooden bunks, they cooked out of the huge iron pots that had been used to previously render whale fat into oil, making it, I guess, the first gold rush greasy spoon, if everybody will pardon the pun, and sailed to San Francisco. It was so full of people who wanted to go to the gold rush, including the crew, that they deserted. And Captain Cleveland ended up selling his ship to be beached, the first one to come ashore, and turned into, at first, a warehouse, and then ultimately offices and the rest, with a structure built on the deck. The image that we're seeing now is a fanciful 1855 drawing that gives you a sense of how that must have felt. One of the great stories of the gold rush talked about a man walking drunk down the street, having recently arrived in town and hit the saloons. Suddenly he came and said, whoa, because there was the bow of a ship rising up from the sidewalk, and he wondered what had happened. And while he'd been in the bar drinking, had there been some huge earthquake that had thrust it up, or a tsunami that had thrown the ship on land? But no, San Francisco was, as one visitor said, a Venice built of pine rather than marble, a city of tides, piers, and ships, a city, the only in North America, where Main Street is visible at low tide.
So these ships, I mean, basically were landfill, is that right?
Some of them were landfill, others just were anchored and moored there and stayed until the decision came to clear downtown. And this image in 1853 shows a number of those ships having been moved out. Oftentimes people talk about these as being abandoned. They weren't really abandoned. Somebody owned them, but they were no longer useful. So think of this as a used car lot where you really can't make any money selling it. And so in this portion of the cove, Chinese fishermen turned laborers worked with one man, Charles Hare, and then a few others, to systematically dismantle these ships for firewood and fittings that they could sell, much like a junkyard would.
And I guess the ones that were under the mud were preserved by the mud, I mean, presumably.
Yeah. When Niantic, and what struck me, what dragged me into maritime archaeology was not just the ship, but in that hold, sealed in the mud, crates that had been sealed since 1851. A man's leather jacket taken off and folded and preserved You could open up a crate and there were bottles of champagne still nested in straw with the liquid in them. Though, yes, we did try it and it was terrible, but.
Hey, special. You were, moving on, you were, Jim, you were 13 years with the National Park Service as director of their Maritime Preservation Service. You worked on some super exciting projects during that time in places like Pearl Harbor and Bikini Atoll. Were those the real learning years for you? Is that where you really ramped up your kind of knowledge base and diving skills?
Absolutely. I worked with some exceptional divers and archaeologists with the Submerged Resources Center of the Park Service, my friends and colleagues, Daniel Lenihan, Larry Murphy, and Tony Carroll, as well as Jerry Livingston and Larry Nordby. And I think the thing is, when you wear a uniform and serve with others, they really are your sisters and your brothers when you are out there. Those guys could dive anywhere. Those men and women could dive anywhere. Pearl Harbor was poignant and powerful, as was Bikini, as the setting for the first atomic bomb tests, and seeing ships on the bottom that had been through the heart of a nuclear blast at the dawn of the atomic age. But what was the real learning experience wasn't just visiting the different sites and seeing the different aspects of history. It was connecting to people, particularly with this more recent history. I was able to meet and talk to veterans who had been there on December 7th, 1941. I was there interviewing folks who had been there, who had dropped that bomb, who had been on some of those ships. And throughout that same time, while I was also working underwater with the Maritime Heritage Program, I was touring the country, making a national survey of every floating preserved historic ship, every lighthouse, every maritime waterfront. And with that, had an opportunity to sail on fireboats, be on a tugboat, sail a schooner, shovel coal into a steamer's boiler. And through that, from literally kicking canvas on a yard or raising sail to all of those experiences and meeting all of these people who connected to that aspect of history. It was an incredible learning experience that surpassed anything I could have ever learned in the classroom, because it was real, but it underscored why I went into archaeology, and that is because it's a story of people and what people do, and how what we build, what we do, what we leave behind reflects who we are.
Yeah, that comes up. That's something that comes up time and again when I was reading about you and just talking and listening to you now, Jim, is the people aspect of this. That's your kind of that's your kind of gateway drug into this, isn't it? It's the people, not just the actual bones of the ship lying on the bottom of the seabed.
Yes, and I think in that, I mean, the medical field has people who study viruses. Others go into the field to be physicians and be in family care. I'm a very people-focused archaeologist, perhaps because my background comes out of anthropology, but also because as a boy I was raised in part by my grandparents. And so at an early age, I learned to appreciate stories from an older generation. And before I ever went into land or maritime archaeology, I was knocking on the doors of all the local farmhouses, interviewing and talking to the families that had been there for decades, if not centuries, and gaining their perspectives. And so with that, fascinated with that, and actually learning to speak Spanish a bit so I could converse with my great-grandmother who couldn't speak English.
Wow.
Yeah, the people is what has always been the driver. But
Yeah.
with that, the other part of that has also been, through that time and later, has been traveling the world and connecting to other people and other cultures and learning perspectives. And a fair amount of that has come from doing exactly what Viking guests do, and that is going to sea and cruising. Though for the most part, many of those years were spent on ships being a lecturer. But in that, I mean, going to a site and having veterans in those days who had been there at D-Day, who had been there at Dieppe, who had been in the early years of this or that aspect of some country's history. And through sailing the 7 seas and visiting close to 100 countries, I realized that I would never stop learning, particularly from other people, but that it was that travel, it was that engagement in other places and other countries and stretching your comfort zone to go into a place where you do not speak perfect Turkish, for example, that enables you to grow and to learn.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think what you just said is probably the thing that motivates most of us to go out and travel. Being a, it's no bad thing in life to find yourself a little bit outside of what we call the comfort zone, and you grow. It help you grow with that, and I think it makes you just a better human being. So Jim, you were 13 years with the National Park Service, and you left to be director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum, which I'm guessing must have been a dream job for you, a little like giving the kid the keys to the candy shop. Did you have a free hand to make the changes you wanted to at the museum?
Well, I'd been to Vancouver before, had friends in Canada, and the museum in many ways really deserved to be the National Maritime Museum of Canada and the Pacific, much like there's the one for the Atlantic in Halifax and in Kingston, Ontario, the one for the lakes. Mm-hmm. It also was the home of one of Canada's great iconic ships, the St. Roch, which was the second ship ever to go through the Northwest Passage. So it had national aspects to its collection, as well as early exploration by the Royal Navy, George Vancouver, James Cook, you name that, and a rich native culture, and also Vancouver as this great port. So that was fascinating. It was compelling. And there was a free hand to work collaboratively and cooperatively with the community and to empower the staff and to bring them into the process of what the museum should do, where we should go. The museum was situated in a town that was rapidly changing demographically, and with that, more families with children and an increasingly Asian population. The first exhibition we worked on was on the Canadian Pacific Railroad steamers connecting to the Far East, but we also began to work to refine, define, and really create a Children's Maritime Discovery Center and do more programming for families with children. That was amazing because, one, I had a very powerful good board with people who mentored me through the process of learning not just to be an archaeologist or a bureaucrat, but a more business-minded, not-for-profit leader, but also a great staff. And I think back to that family, that team. It was much like the crew of the ship. Stay in touch with them still. And the Maritime Museum was, as you could say, it really was not just a candy shop, but a place where we could focus on not only telling the story of Vancouver as a port, but its connection to the wider Pacific, the story of that Pacific, but because of St. Roch, the fabled Northwest Passage. So as part of all of that, I mean, that included traveling the world to pull together what would be a major exhibition on the Northwest Passage, going to Greenwich and holding Franklin's last note in my hand, thanks to my colleagues there at the National Maritime Museum, going to Norway and seeing Amundsen's Maud, but also going up into the north and working on some archaeology as the years went by. And I could take more time to do some of that, in addition to also running the museum, largely thanks to an exceptional deputy director, Raylene Marchand, who really looked after the place for the few months each year that I would be gone, being a scholar, being an archaeologist, or doing research for exhibitions, or cruising the world.
And what a lovely place to live and work, Vancouver. Great city, I love it.
I would walk out some days and just look out over English Bay, and there are ships from all over the world that are getting ready to load or discharge a cargo. The community was diverse, and the setting was beautiful. And yeah, talk about sailing. One of the benefits of the job was being an honorary member of the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah, it was a tremendous job. But I would also say this is that the 20 years I spent in Canada, 15 as the director of the museum, brought about a very fundamental change in my own philosophy, because I had come from just a government background and as a scientist, and this gave me a chance to focus, again, on people, which I care about, but also in other ways, being part of a community which had people in need, reaching out to children who had difficulty, problems in school, things like that, working with different corporate sponsors to create programs, and ultimately becoming a dual citizen, a Canadian as well. all of that was an amazing middle period in my life, from literally from about age, 31, 32 to almost age 50.
Yeah, 15 years or more. Yeah, yeah. And it was whilst you were at or in Vancouver that the world of television came a knocking on your door with the National Geographic Sea Hunter series. So how did you take the demands of television program making? Because that can be that's a whole new world. Well, it was for you then, I guess.
Well, I'd done a little bit of this or that when I was in the Park Service, particularly when you're at a national park that includes a place like Alcatraz, where people are always coming to shoot a documentary or a feature film. But this was a whole new education. And again, meeting another family, working closely with a talented group of filmmakers out of Halifax. John Davis was the producer and the creator of the series, working with Clive Cussler, the American novelist whose books had been the impetus of the story. Master Doctor Mike Fletcher, his son Warren, cameraman Mark Pike, son and John Rosborough. I mean, being part of a tight-knit group and traveling and going to sites was great. But the ethos of the show as well was we provided access through over our shoulder, opening the world of my colleagues and their research to the public. And so it wasn't we went out and found a ship. It wasn't as if the story was about us. Occasionally we'd have a show where we'd do something like that. But it was more meet our colleagues in the Baltic as they begin to investigate and study an intact ship from 1774 with 33 crates still in the hold, preserved in the cold waters of the Baltic, with paintings belonging to Catherine the Great, to diving underground in the heart of Germany in a flooded series of caves that were a Nazi concentration camp used to build V1 and V2s, to diving off the coast of Normandy on the wrecks from D-Day and a Royal Navy ship crewed by Canadians destroyed by a German buzz bomb at the height of the D-Day landings, to the Titanic of the North Pacific, the Princess Sophia, which sank, hung up on a reef for days in a storm, and no one lived. And the last call was a faint one from the radio room saying, "For God's sakes, hurry, the water is coming into my room." So many stories like that. But again, working with people around the world, thanks to a very talented film crew that enabled us to provide a portal and an opening for the rest of the world to see, but for our colleagues to share. That was wonderful, and it was an education, because that's when I really began, of course, not just to travel and do television, but also be there with a ringside seat as amazing discoveries were made by colleagues.
I'm just wondering how many young maritime archaeologists you inspired through. I remember as a child myself, at the age that you first got interested in archaeology, my thing was marine biology, and my hero was Jacques Cousteau, and those wonderful TV series you have, which you look at them now, and I mean they're all compared to what we have now, they look so happy, but it was just thrilling stuff, and I never became that marine biologist, but boy, he really inspired me, and I guess you probably did the same with the Sea Hunter series.
Well, it was great because we knew that it was making a difference. The show appeared in 172 international jurisdictions. So it's surreal to be filming in Vietnam and turn on the television and see yourself with the crew in an earlier show, and you're speaking perfect Vietnamese. Or Russian, or Swedish. But what also happened is that it was that connection. So many people watched it and liked it, and the beauty of it was I could be filling my tank with fuel at the gas station. Mm-hmm. And I would have the fellow that was there at the pump asking stories about the show, or I'd be standing in line at the grocery store and some grandmother would tap me on the shoulder and say, "Now, what about that?" And so it reached so many people. And that's what it was all about, was really telling stories and connecting people.
And presumably the Vancouver Museum are pretty happy to have this kind of, that you were doing this. That was a little feather in their cap as well, I guess.
Well, when we would do things like discover, as the Sea Hunters, the wreck of the Carpathia, the ship that rescued Titanic survivors and then was sunk by a German U-boat in World War I, we also had a relationship with the Vancouver Sun, so that I was able to write a front page story, because I was a journalism minor in college. And so
Okay. Yeah.
So to be able to do that, let's just say the fundraising at the museum, thanks to the sea hunters, increased 700%.
Wow.
So they liked it, but what they also liked was it was money, and fundraising and donations helped keep the museum going and to do programs, but it was those relationships that were established. It was that wider world that would come. My predecessor, Robin Ingalls, had done a beautiful job in working internationally, and I was able to build on that. And so that's where you go. It's the old Athenian city oath. You go into a job, you go into a place, and you work to leave it better than when you found it. And you don't do that by tearing down everything that had been done before. You add to it, you augment it, you adapt to change, but you're ever building.
Absolutely. You've worked on so many fascinating underwater wrecks, and it was really difficult for me to decide on which ones we should just have a little zoom in on. One that did jump out at me was I really loved this one, was the world's oldest known submarine, which was a kind of hybrid submarine and diving bell. We have a picture of it on the screen, and ended up being used for a very particular purpose. How did you just tell us how you came across this rather strange looking beast on a seashore somewhere?
Well, I was on a cruise.
You were on cruises. Yeah.
And we were going through the Panama Canal and coming onto the Pacific side, and the expedition leader said, "Hey, there's a story of a submarine beached on a little island in the Pearls, the Archipelago de las Perlas, that's said to be a Japanese submarine used in the World War II to try to attack the Panama Canal. You want to go check it out?" So early in the morning, we anchored the ship, and I zoomed off in a Zodiac with a crew member, and waited for the tide to fall on the beach, and the tidal range is about 3 meters. So as it dropped, this thing appeared, and it wasn't a Japanese midship submarine from World War II. It was a strange looking craft. So I came back for the next couple of years, activating passengers on the cruise to be we call them the submarine explorers. And we went out and we documented and mapped it. It led to a longer range project in which we completely documented and learned that it had been built as this automobile craft known as the Submarine Explorer, built by a German immigrant to the United States and a Civil War Army veteran named Navy veteran, named Julius Kroll. Crail, as the family pronounced it, because they'd originally been from Scotland and had left after some problems being Jacobites to settle in what would become Prussia.
Right.
The submarine was built in 1863, 64, finished in 65, and in 66 went out there. And it was used to harvest pearls because you could pressurize it, drop to the bottom, see the outside pressure, pressurize to match that on the inside, and then open a hatch at the bottom of the sub and start picking oysters with shells and pearls right off the seabed. The problem was, as they would later determine, when you operate at pressure and come up quickly without decompressing, you get the bends, as divers know. So the submarine didn't really work well. It's another one of those Dr. Frankenstein stories where you create something and it hurts you. But this craft had been sitting there for years. It was an amazing part of my career. And I guess one of the things that my friends all know is when I get a bone, I will seize that bone and pick on it. So the craft is now detailed and documented in a series of plans in the Library of Congress in the Historic American Engineering Record. We wrote a book about it. We did a documentary with the Smithsonian and with German television. And the story just keeps going. But Explorer sits there, the tide rising and falling, on and around its grave on Isla San Telmo in the Archipelago de las Perlas in the Bay of Panama.
So it's still, the Explorer is still sitting there?
Yes. The idea was not to raise it. The locals in the nearby fishing village, who were descendants of enslaved people brought to dive for pearls, made money by taking people out to look at it. They didn't know the story. When we first went out, they thought it was Japanese. They also told me that everybody that went into it died. They remembered, because their ancestors had worked in this, that if you got the bends, you could be hurt or die. But, we could have spent a fair amount of money trying to raise and recover that and put it in a museum. But here you have this community of a few hundred people who are out there. This is one means by which they make a living, as well as selling some of the pearls they dive for. in a community that has no sewage system, has a tiny school, limited medical facilities. I ended up saying if money was to be raised for anything, it should be for that community. The fun thing, though, is that they did have satellite TV, and when we came to do a Sea Hunters episode, we approached in the boat, and all the children on the beach started chanting, Canal 5, Canal 5, Canal 5, Channel 5.
Great. I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's rather lovely that it is where it is, and it'll slowly just go back, become part of the sea, I mean, over time. And I think that's lovely. It would have been a shame to sort of, pick it up and put it on a container and ship it out.
It's their submarine now, and it's been there longer than any other place. So I said ashes to ashes, rust to rust on that one.
Well, that's very good. Well, look, Jim, let's travel back to 1912, and you'll know exactly where I'm heading immediately. The early morning hours of April the 15th, 1912, what was then the world's largest ocean liner on her maiden voyage, the supposedly unsinkable Titanic, hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean and sunk down to the seabed 2.5 miles below. From that, we fast forward to the year 2000, and we have you, Jim, inside a tiny submersible called a Mir, I think, traveling down 12,000 feet to make an assessment of the wreck. So, a question you've probably never been asked before. What's it like looking at the Titanic underwater?
Well, Titanic is one of those, a number of my colleagues asked, they said, well, what's there to learn? We have plans, it's documented. I said, well, what there is to learn is sort of not just, the questions of how did it break apart? Did it strike us? What did it do? I said, there are aspects of this that speak powerfully to the human experience, and I'll get to that, not just through the tragedy, but in another way. I said, but as well, people are interested. I went out actually not to assess the wreck, but at the invitation of the then cruise company that was mounting these expeditions for people to pay and watch, to see if this was appropriate and safely done cultural tourism. Safe, of course, in terms, I wasn't there to determine whether the subs are safe. You had exceptional expertise there. This was the Russians working through the Shirsov Institute of Oceanology in Kaliningrad. And these are the subs that, if anybody has seen both the IMAX film Titanica or Jim Cameron's film Titanic, will recognize, particularly under the leadership of Dr. Anatoly Sagaleyevich. So we went out on the academic Mstislav Keldysh, and I was able to take a dive with the deep sea explorations folks and see firsthand. The Russians were exceptional sub-pilots. Now, it is somewhat surreal to become an aquanaut, which you get to be, I guess, after you've dropped, 2.5 miles to the ocean floor. You wear a Nomex flight suit because you're breathing pure oxygen. If there's a spark, they don't want you to completely burn. You don't really eat or drink much before you go for some very obvious reasons. You're in a 6-foot diameter sphere with 2 others for 12 or more hours. So you fast. You also spend, before you go, a fair amount of time in your cabin with your hand under warm water, standing at a certain place. So anyway, with all of that, off you go, and you get lifted up in this sub and dropped into the Atlantic. And a little tiny boat, Koresh is its name, it's a friend. Mir means peace, Koresh is a friend. They tow you off a bit, and then they cast you free. And the pilot, in this case ours, was Evgenia Cherniev.
Yeah.
Floods a few things, valves open, and you drop. And you commence to drop, and it seems as if you're not really moving. But what the sub is doing is spiraling down into the darkness, and you fall for 2.5 hours into the darkness. The pressure increases, but you don't feel that. You're in one atmosphere, the same as I'm in this room. But you think about it. We approached the bottom, we landed, lifted off this thick abyssal mud, and then suddenly came up to, and there was Titanic, the side of it, this huge steel wall rusting in the darkness with orange and red and yellow cascading out of seams, rust forming on the sides of the hull, but the hull still painted black. And then you start moving over those decks. And ever the scientist, of course, I'm making notes constantly. I'm looking at Genius Control, how well he's doing. Of course, we stopped at the iconic bow. This was before Jim had made the movie, so the bow had different meaning then. But it is the one place, it's probably one of the most iconic images of the late 20th century, is the bow of Titanic underwater. So we move along, and suddenly we get to a spot, and you know the story because it's been there. It's in all these books. It's been in the films. And suddenly there we were, and I was looking, and it was lifeboat number 8, and the davit was still hanging. And you start to think about what happened there. And the story is, of course, this is where Isidore and Ida Strauss, rich and famous, some of the more notable victims of the sinking, are there. And the order has been given, and Officer Lightoller is interpreting it as women and children only, as opposed to first. And as this happens, Mrs. Strauss is in the boat, but does not want to leave her husband. And she's crying. He's standing back with other men. And while there's pandemonium on other parts of the deck, and people are pushing and fighting, and shots are being fired to get people away from lifeboats, this is an oasis of calm in the midst of that chaos. And finally, the officer says, well, then, Mr. Strauss, maybe you can go as an older gentleman. And he says, I can't. If the other gentlemen aren't going, I cannot. And that's the social structure of the time. And I think anybody that's ever watched Downton Abbey gets it. So he says, well, then she gets out of the boat. She tells him that she's known him for so many years, that this is her life. She loves him. And they go off together and die together. And just a story until you're right there, surrounded in darkness, having fallen through darkness for 2.5 hours to confront this place. And there you are. And while the corrosion of time and silt are there, time has stood still in a way. And it becomes very real. And that was the first and not the last time that I cried on Titanic, because if you've ever loved and lost, as so many of us have, you know what kind of love that was.
So you give me goosebumps here, man. Yeah. Whoa. I mean, because the discovery of the wreck was a little earlier. Was in, I think, 1985. And it straight away generated a lot of controversy, which we can talk about whether or not a site like that should be visited or disturbed in any way. And I mean, what was your position on? Did you take a position on that from?
I've always believed that people should be able to go and visit sites. I have a different view if people want to take a souvenir home for themselves. You don't go to a historic, you don't go to a UK historic site and take home a stone from the you don't get to take a piece of Hadrian's Wall, right? You don't go to a battlefield and just laugh and have a picnic over graves. You have some respect, and so the tourism has always been there, and it's always been respectful. And I've seen a fair amount of archaeological tourism, and I still engage in that, lecturing from time to time for the Archaeological Institute of America and others, and on ships. And I've been on a Viking river cruise where I, as a passenger, participated in tours, including an amazing site on one of the river cruises of a very old site. People were magnificent, and they learned something. And so that's what that's all about. But I do draw the line at anybody taking something home. Now, Titanic has been the subject of controversy because artifacts have been recovered. And while there has been a fair amount of upset over the bankruptcy of the company and the thought of the collection being auctioned off, the courts have taken a strong step, and the company itself has taken a strong step to keep everything together. It's accessible through displays and exhibitions. And while I wish as an archaeologist things might have been picked up with some more archaeology behind it, early on it was just, that's interesting, let's get it.
Because part of the problem was that the ship was in international water, is in international waters, so it doesn't come under any particular jurisdiction. So anybody with the means could go and pick up what they could and then sell it at private auction, presumably for a lot of money. I mean, there must have been,
Yeah, which is why when I was at the museum, they had a series of meetings. Greenwich, National Maritime Museum Greenwich was going to mount the first big museum exhibition of this outside of the one in Paris. And I advised, and we agreed that we would have an international meeting in Greenwich. And with that meeting, people came together to talk about different perspectives on what might happen with Titanic. And then afterwards, with UK government officials, I was no longer a US government official, but some friends had come over, with Canadian friends as well. We all went into a back room and we wrote the draft of what today is the now in force international agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States on Titanic, which Canada would be hopefully soon joining and which other countries can. And what that does is it means that within the limits of their own laws, we can say, no, you're not going to go out and cut into it. But also what's happened is that the law of salvage, admiralty law, an ancient law, is in effect. And with that, the judge in the United States has acted incredibly responsibly to encourage proper approaches, a fund to make sure that the collection is never orphaned, and that scientific rigor be applied increasingly. And so through that, that's how you get some semblance of the law in the frontier, that is the deep ocean. And with that, I think, Titanic keeps reminding all of us that it is one of so many ships that are down there that in that deep, dark ocean speak powerfully as time capsules, in some cases remarkably intact. And little did I realize 21 years ago in Titanic that I'd be back in 2010 working with the various governments and with the salvagers to raise it virtually by documenting it, in 3D, imagery photogrammetry with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and that would form the basis of the first major overall photographic looks of Titanic in time for the 100th anniversary.
Yeah, well, that brings us nicely back to actually what I said at the beginning about, which was a quote from you, about the underwater world being the greatest museum in the world. Because I think there's something, did I read somewhere there's 3 million wrecks on the bottom of the seabed? I mean, some phenomenal number scattered as well.
That's a guesstimate. I would say that probably in terms of big tangible things, it's probably half that. And majority of the wrecks on the bottom of the sea date to the last 2 centuries, because the industrial world and the increasingly globally connected world built more and more ships, the UK in particular, then the United States and others. And the the 2 world wars left the largest number of ships on the bottom of the sea.
Yeah, absolutely. But now that the Titanic, now that we know where she's lying, is there another holy grail of a shipwreck out there that everyone's desperate to discover, or which is going to make your name, or is that not that your name isn't already made, but you know what I mean?
I would say that the idea of a holy grail shipwreck, for people, I mean, you're going to find every time something new is found, and I've been there for some of these discoveries we've made. It makes a headline. It gets people interested. But this is not trophy hunting, and this is all about science. So for me, and it's connecting to people, and I'm joined in that by so many of my colleagues. So it's not like let's go find this or that historic ship. When a historic ship is found, something that has name recognition, I think it does attract attention. But when you have that attention, I think your responsibility is then to focus on some things. One of which is the importance of the oceans and the state of the oceans, the physical health of the oceans, the state of the fisheries, pollution, all of that. And that's why when I left the museum, and after spending 5 years running the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, co-leading, I should say, with colleagues, I went back to the government, joined the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at NOAA, because the mission there was to take cultural heritage and natural heritage, which should have no boundaries. I mean, there's marine life that grows on wrecks. Wrecks are habitat for fish. There's so many ways in which they're connected. But when you have, go back to your turn of phrase, a holy grail shipwreck, when suddenly the world is watching, you have the pulpit for a moment to say, while I have your attention, let's talk about what we see here. With Titanic, there's debris and garbage, because the oceans were being filled with garbage, and there was plastic on Titanic, cups and debris tossed by ships.
Yeah.
You go to other areas and you see, in the midst of a war grave, that people have been blasting and scrapping it. I recall one of the Sea Hunters trips going out into the Pacific and looking at HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales, lost in the early days of the war in the Pacific. And when you went into those ships, the bones of so many British boys were lying in there, particularly in the engineering spaces, were never photographed, you never film it, you're entering a tomb, and you don't wish to tarry long. You respect it, and the point is not to go look at that. But then to realize with a moment like that, that within a few years, scrappers are going to come along. And it's been headlines in the news, cut apart and raise these graves and kick bones off the side of the deck back into the ocean, no longer in a tomb, because all they care about is the metal. Then these are stories that need to be shared when you have that moment, to encourage preservation, to encourage a respectful approach to the seas, or to inspire the next generation, or as well just to remind yourself that learning isn't confined to the young. I still learn. I'm still a student, as are so many others. And so this idea of lifelong learning, something that was powerfully underscored when I married my wife, who's a librarian. And if nobody else believes about lifelong learning, librarians do. So that's what it's all about. So I'm not out to find other great iconic ships, but there are times when a project comes along where you realize that this has tremendous societal meaning for a variety of ways, or through a variety of ways. And so you then act accordingly and you act responsibly.
Well, your work, Jim, must have changed immeasurably in your lifetime with all the amazing new technology available. I mean, you mentioned 3D scanning, but and the GPS and just all the stuff that computers can do now, using remotes. You don't need to go down in a submersible anymore. Just send a remote down. I mean, it's been a huge change that you've lived through.
It has. When I've gotten wet these days, it's been wading in shallow water environments, but I don't dive deep anymore. The last time I was in a sub was several years ago, but robotics all the time. And now the benefit of robotics is that with telepresence, with satellite links, I can co-direct a dive and work with colleagues from all over the world, as we are now talking here from my own office, out to a ship. And at the height of COVID, working with the British-based company Ocean Infinity, we were able, thanks to their robotics and their generous offer of a stop and drop opportunity as they were transiting, autonomous underwater robots dived and surveyed 100 square miles of seabed 3 miles deep, and we located the remains of the American battleship Nevada, a very famous American ship, worked on it remotely through telepresence as the ROV inspected it and filmed it, and then shared it, particularly in the midst of COVID, not only as, here, this is how you do a socially distanced project, but also a reminder of a ship that had gone through so much through its career, particularly surviving the attack at Pearl Harbor, torpedoed and bombed and yet still resilient. At D-Day, off of Okinawa, taking shell hits in a kamikaze, and then being the aiming point for the atomic tests at Bikini to survive as the ship that would not die. Americans love this reputation of not only being resilient, but stubborn. And here was one of them, a stubborn American battleship. And so that story resonated throughout the country and also reached internationally to say, here it is at the bottom of the sea, not really lost, but a sinking coordinate from a group of ships and planes strafing and bombing it for 5 days, and then it sinks, is different from actually going down 3 miles with a robot and seeing it there, upside down and battered, but with portions torn away so that you could go into a compartment still painted, and with the serial on the side of the wall, that is the serial number, know exactly where you were. And then through that, again, coming back and connecting to families, as well as veterans. And one of Dr. Charles Sahi is in his late 90s, and he was on that ship that day at Pearl Harbor, and he knows it well. And so talking to Dr. Sahi, hearing his stories and being able to understand it a little differently, because even if it's through a robot, I know where he's been. It was like the work on the Arizona and interviewing those guys, and so many of them were alive, to talk to Donald Stratton and to know where he was and what portion of deck he had to traverse on fire after Arizona exploded before he tumbled into the water, to have surgery after surgery, but to return to battle and fight through the war and live into his 90s.
Wow.
There was that bond formed because I knew where he was. I'd been there physically. I dived it. I hovered over the deck and touched the tangled fire hoses where a group of men had been incinerated in that fireball when the final blast came. And through that experience, nothing like the experience they went through, but at least through knowing the place and having done the work, having the privilege of meeting these people and talking with them.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you just reminded me actually, although this is a very different kind of ship, but one of the great excavations that really impressed me was, and you'll have seen this, is the in Oslo, the Osberg Saga Viking ship, which was not underwater, was buried in it was, I think, a chieftain, or it was buried in his ship, which is really impressive. And I think that a lot of learning came from that, about how the Vikings built ships and how they traveled.
Well, it did, and I think that's, one of the most amazing things with all of this is that you have the Hollywood view.
Yeah.
And right now I'm in the midst of watching The Last Kingdom. So there's Danes rampaging over 9th century England, and Alfred is holding out in Wessex. And you see this depiction of them, and you have this certain view. The ships are one aspect, though, that speaks to something else, and that is Viking is something you do. It's not who you are. And so the Scandinavians have families, they have beliefs, they're explorers as well as conquerors and raiders. One of the guys very truthfully says, you need land, you need wealth, you raid. But not everybody does that. And so the archaeology in Scandinavia has begun to define a more nuanced view of it all. But it also, in terms of the maritime archaeology, the first ships found, like the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, the Tuna ship, that are now in the Skippertol in Oslo, tell one aspect of it, because like the Sutton Hoo ship, these are ships, royal ships, expensive ships that are used for burials. But in Denmark at Roskilde, just outside of Copenhagen, you've got this site where a number of ships were scuttled, about a century or so after the events in the Last Kingdom, to protect this community. And like the Edeby ship or some of the others that were sacrificed as religious rituals, these are fragmented, but they have not sunk full of artifacts. But what the archaeology of Roskilde showed us was there were different types of craft, not just the Drakarskipet, the big fighting warships, but craft that were used to transport families, horse transports, a variety of things. In other words, there was the Viking ship has far more complexity to it. And interestingly enough, thanks to some work in Istanbul, which is the Ottoman Empire knew the Vikings, but long before that, so did the Byzantines. And the Byzantine emperors are guarded by Scandinavian warriors. And so with Ola Kromlin Pedersen, one of the great scholars of Scandinavian ships, team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Dr. Jamal Pulak and others, we're seeing the comparisons between the road warships of the Byzantine Empire, the Galea, with the Viking ships. And they're connected, they're together, and that connection goes way back. And so the archaeology moves beyond the ship to the idea of people connected, the ocean being this connecting force, or the rivers stretching down through Russia and into the Black Sea. And through that, I think the fun part was this: Jamal is working there, and Pedersen is seeing this likely exchange, I should say, between Scandinavians and Byzantines about how to build a ship, particularly for war and for fast movement. It goes back to an excavation that Jamal had done at the oldest then site known, the Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, 3,300 years old. And amongst the finds there is amber from the Baltic, as well as goods from items from 12 other regions, showing global trade is happening in the Bronze Age while King Tut is on the throne of Egypt. And that's what archaeology is all about.
Fantastic. Jim, I need to let you go Viking in a minute, but before you do, is there anything you can tell us about what you're working on now? What are you up to these days? What do you got going on?
There's always something on the back burner because you never know when something's going to be found. And there have been a few discoveries as of late that we may get involved in. At this point, what we're doing is writing up the results of the work of the last few years, which was the identification of a vessel that we now know is the last ship to bring enslaved people to America. Captured in Africa, brought against their will in the schooner Clotilda and landed outside of Mobile, Alabama in 1860. And again, what is powerful with this is that there is a descendant community. And those families very powerfully know this story. Yeah. Learning the identity of the ship, which was sitting on the bank of the river, hidden mostly by the water, has been a powerful moment because it's largely intact. It was burned by its captain to hide the evidence of the crime in July 1860. We've had to apply a fair amount of forensics to it. So while we're writing up the forensics, what I'm also working on now with the community is what this vessel represents to them, what it represents to others. This may likely be the only ship engaged in the transatlantic slave trade where, as archaeologists, we are able to physically go into the hold itself, where these people were held against their will in horrific conditions for that voyage across to enter a life of enslavement, which would end, given the American Civil War, within a period of years, but just the same, a defining experience. They never were able to go home, but they created a community they named Africa Town, where they persevered, they persisted, they kept their values, and they passed those on to their descendants, who are a strong and resilient community. And so with that, working on that now comes right back to what started for me 40 odd years ago. It's not the places, it's not the things. It's the doors that open that teach you about people and connect you to people.
It's the people. Yeah, yeah. Beautiful. Well, Jim, I'll admit, until I knew that I was going to be having this conversation with you, the world of maritime archaeology wasn't huge in my life, but it's a lot. But having read a lot about, because you've written a huge amount of, you've written a lot of books and you've published an awful lot of papers, and working my way through them, yeah, I can quite see why you find it a fascinating subject. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today on Viking.TV. And yeah, go Viking, Jim. I wish you go get out there, and good luck. And I hope I'll see you maybe one day on a cruise ship.
That sounds wonderful. And as they say, tak.
Tak. Goodbye. There we go. Wow, that was wonderful. And I really enjoyed talking with Jim. And thank you all for watching, wherever you may be in the world. Where I am now, winter is slowly becoming spring. And that's something we can all be happy about. So best wishes from me. And until the next time for another conversation, take care and goodbye.